Yeah, so this is Phenomenalism, Skepticism, and Sellars' account of intentionality by Griffin Clemick in the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. And as always, feel free to ask questions along the way. My first time reading this, so we're going to find out what this person has to say. So, introduction. Perhaps the most fundamental claim Lutz Christopher Siebert's dense but deeply interesting book makes about Wilfrid Sellars is buried in an endnote. I stressed the Kantian elements in Sellars' thinking over his scientific inclinations, as his commitment to Kant's transcendental methodology of explicating the concepts of intentionality run deeper than and is the ground on which to reconstruct his commitment to scientific realism. Okay, so that was a mouthful, but basically it's saying that, because actually this turns out there's a book symposium over here, book symposium contribution. So we're talking about this Siebert's book on Sellars, and the whole thing is they're making a big claim that it's really at base it's a Kantian book, even though Sellars is trying to be scientific. They're still saying it's Kantian, and you can think about this if you're thinking about like what is the world. People say, look, you don't know what you see is not real, but what's real are the atoms. And that's the exact same sort of setup that Kant has. You can see the phenomenal world, but what's real, the noumenal world, is the atoms. And so that's sort of a Kantian scientific view, because we can't actually get at the atoms. We deal with our world that it is like right here, like whatever this is, this phenomena, but not get at the stuff below it, which is the atoms. We can only infer about those. All right. Siebert, in effect, positions himself against the typical view that Sellars' deepest philosophical commitment is to naturalism, suggesting that we more accurately, if less elegantly, capture Sellars' central philosophical outlook by regarding him not as a scientific naturalist, but as committed to a transcendental phenomenalism with a transcendentally demanded realism. The realism and even its transcendental character are familiar dimensions of Sellars' thought, but the transcendental phenomenalism is the key substantive innovation in Siebert's reading of Sellars. Before examining it, though, let's consider the problem of intentionality and the broad strokes of the transcendental project Sellars undertakes in response to it. Yeah, and keep in mind what you mean by phenomenalism. What is the phenomena you're seeing? That's what we're talking about, phenomenalism. And in phenomenology, what is it that you see in the world? So are you seeing the atoms, or are you seeing patches of color, or are you seeing objects? Like, are you seeing my head on your screen? Like, or an image of the head, but still a head, like my face. Like, are you seeing my face, or are you seeing color patches, which you then infer to be a face? And so these are different ways that you can describe the phenomena, and that's part of the transcendental phenomenalism. What is it that you are seeing in the world? What is the phenomena? And they're claiming that this is, you're seeing something transcendental. You're going beyond what you see. Okay. How is it even possible for the contents of our experiences and thoughts to be objective, to refer to objects? It might initially seem that no deep solution to this problem is available, since it's necessary for objective purport is that objects should exist and relate to subjects in various ways. Any solution to it seemingly must presuppose objective purport in explaining how it arises. Yeah, so if you think you're seeing like the actual head, how does that happen? Like, where does the thing that is my face show up in your mind? Because that's an object. So how do you explain how that happens, where you get the full face, in your head? Like, how does that happen? Okay, such a solution might still be informative, but its ambitions would be modest. The interest of Sellars' Kantian transcendental approach to intentionality lies in its refusal, thus, to restrict its ambitions. Rather than simply presupposing intentionality and then asking how it's possible, the transcendental approach treats objective purport as itself an open question, and so does not presuppose anything about the object of putatively objectively contentful representation, but takes it to be a mere placeholder. Okay, so what you're seeing is just a mere placeholder. You're not seeing the real world, basically. It begins instead with the subject arguing from elements of our subjectivity to the existence of independent objects and to the subjective capacities our ability to represent them presupposes. Sellars offers us a transcendental psychology after the linguistic turn, aiming to disclose the presuppositions binding for any conceptual system that functions as yielding empirical knowledge. Yeah, so what you're getting is you're getting like a face placeholder thing, but that's not real. Like there's some other object, there's a human on the other side. And so there's some psychology of understanding of, a face, a human face. Of course, there's going to be some like human psychology associated with that. But like that is the start for what we think about. Extremely roughly and briefly, I take Seaworth to interpret Sellars' transcendental account of intentionality as follows. We can begin explicating the notion of an object of representation without stepping outside the subjective sphere by following Kant in the Transcendental Analytic, interpreting the object as that which gives unity to various representations, the principle that grounds necessary relations between them. Yeah, so again, what the hell does that mean? If you think of a face, then you can then place like the eyes, the nose, the mouth together. But you need something that gives unity to the various representations. Otherwise, you can't can't understand what you're looking at. So if you think about the faces that which organizes all the things like right here, then you can understand that's the organizing factor. Okay, and since the categories constitute the necessary features any system of representation is characterized by, they necessarily are constitutive of thinking a Gegenstand überhaupt. I have no idea what the German is. I apologize for being dumb. In particular, knowledge of the here and now presupposes general truths of the sort captured by law-like statements. Still, this leaves us with a very thin notion of the object. It remains in appearance a mere common content of various apprehendings. Yeah, so if you think any old time, what do you actually have then? Well, you need some idea, like some general like notion, these general law-like statements about the universe, but like that's not a whole lot. Okay, only in turning from spontaneity to receptivity, and so schematizing the concept of an object of representation, do we reach the notion of objects in themselves as a transcendental postulate. Quote, although we are in fact although all we are in fact in touch with are representings, these representings need to be seen as the result of an external impact on our senses, one generated by the in itself and immediately producing a manifold of non-conceptual sense impressions. We synthesize these impressions first into image models, essentially point of view laden, and thus, since worldly objects are non-perspectival, transcendentally ideal patterns of sensed and imaged proper and common sense qualities, and subsequently into intuitions, singular conceptual representations. So, like of the form, like, quote, the brick with a red surface. So it's like a face that you can see on the screen. So that incorporate objects' causal and categorical features too. This account enables us to render the objects of representation more concrete, construing it as the commonality of content across image models, or that in the appearance which systematically varies in relation to our perspectives on it. Okay, again, what I was saying. How do you see things? You get this sort of unifying idea, like you see a face, and that's how you organize your thoughts around. So you very Kantian sort of thought. You have concepts in your head, like you see a face, the concept of a face, and that's how you organize what you're looking at when you're looking at people. Granted, the people who have faces, or like maybe a dog has a face or whatever else, that external world, whatever that thing is in itself, impresses upon us, and then we have the concept of face, which organizes our understanding of these things in the world. And this is sort of the Kantian way of explaining how things are, Kantian theory of mind, and how we apprehend the world. Okay, for Kantians, it's intuition's job to give objects to the mind for judgment. Yeah, see, right here. How do you get that first initial thing? Get it in, and you like organize it by the concept of face in this case. Intuition. It's the intuition's job. And then you sort of make judgments about that. Yet Seaworth sees intuition's dependence transcendentally ideal image models as problematizing this function. It means that the reference of intuitions points only back to internal objects of image models, not to the objects that brought them about. Yeah, so where do you get the idea of face from? Just has to come in from somewhere. So like, where does that come from the get-go? And he's saying you have to talk about the object that brought them out, not the internal like mind that just projects it onto it. But is that a problem? I don't know, but like, that's what you have to say something about that. This explains the non-relational character of Sellars' theory of intentionality proper. He construes a term's meaning and reference as a matter of its norm-governed functional role in the language, and a statement's truth a matter of its correct assertability relative to the norms of language, not as genuine relations between items in the conceptual order and items in the real order. But less this... not as genuine relations in the concepts and items in the real. So you're not really doing it's just sort of like this in your mind thing. So it's not genuine relations about the world. Okay, but lest this theory land him in linguistic idealism. Lumpy, how you doing? Welcome in. Yeah, this is actually a very complicated paper we're reading right now. But yeah, thank you for the lurk. I appreciate it. All right. So yeah, we're talking about the theory of mind on Kantian theory of mind here. But lest this theory land him in linguistic idealism, cutting our conceptual activity off from and rendering it unaccountable to the natural world, he supplements his theory of intentionality. And thank you for the 100 bits. Appreciate that. Why are my freaking alerts busted? I'm annoyed. Yeah, so he supplements his theory of intentionality with a theory of picturing, which describes a non-semantic isomorphism or complex covariation between basic empirical linguistic items and the worldly entities that ground the sense of our referring expressions and the norms that constitute empirical truth. All right, and this is a Wittgensteinian moves for people who know a little bit of Wittgenstein. You say, okay, linguistic forms like the grammar or the logic, it then sort of has its own structure, and you can like overlay the structure of the grammar onto the world. And so like the thing that says like something is red, that has a structure about the color, and like so if it was blue, that would sort of like overlay the color that the structure of the language that is like on top of the world. And if it was like red and you say red, then it matches up, and it doesn't. And so you can see an isomorphism. Either the colors match up to like the words, like the red matches up to the red in the world, and if it doesn't, then it's like it's missing, like, and so it's like it misses the world. And so this is a Wittgensteinian way of matching your language to the world. It's the picture theory out of the Tractatus. Okay, on Siebert's account, then, Sellars is a transcendental phenomenalist. Oh, yeah, and Wittgenstein was very Kantian early on, at least. I don't know about later, but, like, this fits in with the Kantian view. On Siebert's account, then, Sellars is a transcendental phenomenalist in holding that our common sense understanding of worldly objects radically distorts them, as well as that we can never immediately perceive the world as such or relate to it through our conceptual activity. Yeah, so again, if you are imposing concepts on the world, you are distorting it inherently. Okay. As well as that, we can never immediately perceive... Okay, yeah, sorry. So this is the thing. If you have to, if you're forcing your logic onto the world, there's no guarantee that's what the world actually looks like. Just is. That's the way it is. But, yeah, and if that's the only way you can match up with what you say about the world, that you're matching your language to the way the world is, then are you actually reading the world, or are you just sort of imposing your will onto the world, your concepts? Again, Kantian thought. Okay, he maintains a transcendently demanded realism in holding that the natural world exists independently of our perception and cognition, that the norms governing our basic empirical discourse render it accountable to the world, and that the analogical concept formation that postulational science involves, together with the mutability of our observation language, renders it possible in principle for us to attain a conceptual scheme that would non-semantically correspond ideally adequately to the world as it is in itself. So that means if we had the right language and we were talking about the world, we could then actually match our language up to the world, and anything that was wrong, we could change up those concepts, and then it would actually, line up. So then you'd have the world over here and your language here, and then they'd perfectly line up. And in principle. I'll pose two clusters of critical questions for Siebert's meticulous reconstruction. The first concerns transcendental phenomenalism. What and let me just I know I keep breaking this up. There's a lot of big words here. Phenomenalism is just saying it's real what you see in the world. Like the phenomena is the right thing. And that's why you've got the language and you've got the world, and that's just the phenomena. It's not phenomenological, which a lot of times would be saying there's more to it than what you're seeing, but like that there's phenomenalism is just saying this is what we have. It's the phenomena. And so it's not phenomenological, it's phenomenal. It's just that's it. Okay. The first concerns transcendental phenomenalism. What precisely is it? And see, this is the problem. This is what I mean. What are you actually talking about? And that's why I want to clarify right there. Has Siebert shown that Sellars' account gives rise to it? And if not, might other features of Sellars' philosophy show this? The second concerns Siebert's response to Richard Rorty's complaint that Sellars' supplementation of his theory of intentionality proper with the theory of picturing opens the door to skepticism. Does Siebert succeed in dispelling this complaint? And if not, what would doing so require? Lumpy says, "Oh, this has all the your brains are hurting." Yeah, I'm sorry, Lumpy. This is actually a pretty nasty paper. This has all the friends, but consider me a one-level slime. Yeah, this one, of course, this is why it's roulette. I did not know what I was walking myself into. I walked everyone into this one. Actually, that's not fair. Evolve Yourself was like, wanted to talk about intentionality too, but you're now talking with two metaphysicians here, me, myself, and Evolve Yourself, and this is a specialized topic in philosophy, and so we've got ourselves in a little bit of a technical talk here. But yeah, again, ask me questions. This is a very, very common theory of mind, or very popular. I don't know about common. It's a very popular thing to say. Hey, look, we have our concepts. We sort of see the world and we perceive them through our concepts. And when our concepts are bad, sometimes we misread the world. Very sort of natural way people go about talking about, dealing with things in life. Like, oh, I didn't understand what I was looking at there because I didn't have the right sort of ideas. And so when I looked at the scene, I didn't really pick out what was important. Happens all the time. You don't understand what someone else is talking about because you don't have the right background. You didn't have the right concepts. So, okay, so phenomenalism. So we're going to talk about what is this thing that we're looking at if all we have are concepts and we're looking at the world, which is the Kantian sort of overall picture. All right, so Sellars' overall position is, Siebert contends, a transcendental phenomenalism combined with a transcendentally motivated realism. The rationale for the realism is familiar. Siebert notes the concern memorably articulated by John McDowell and Carl Sachs that Sellars' theories of perception and intentionality might leave cognition spinning in the void without having any friction with a realm outside the conceptual. Lumpy says, I had one of the most stressful days in years. Oh God, I'm sorry. I managed to come up on top and I'm navigating difficult chemistry situation. And with the glitters tossed. Boom. Well, I'm very, very pleased that you were able to come out on top. Chemistry is very, very difficult. I know this. So yeah. I know you had some success last week. You were able to come up with a new process, and you found that just made your company a bunch of like $20,000, you said, which is very good. But then success means that they give you more hard problems to solve, and it's hard. But yeah, so I wish you the best, and some mental rest. You need turn off sometimes. So if my stream can't do that, go find one that can. I'm not gonna begrudge you your chill out time. Yeah. Anyway, so the question here is, if you are only talking about concepts and that's all you have in your head, then are you only ever able to think about concepts about other concepts? Are you actually ever talking about anything in the world? Because if you already got things in the world are only perceived through the concepts you have, then how do you actually talk about things in the world? Because you're only still talking about the concepts. And if your concepts are only changed by other concepts, how do you actually get anything new in? All the best vibes for you. Absolutely. Basically, Lumpy says, we're tasked to do a molecule everyone else failed at, and fast. Yeah. I know. It's like, well, it's the old joke, the engineering joke. You want something done right, you want something done cheap, or you want it done fast. And you can only pick two. And so if they're asking for fast and right, that means it should be costing them an inordinate amount of money if possible. Like, there's no other way. Because, like, it's just, it's like you're asking for the impossible. You need all the resources and all the effort to go in right now. Cinesemiac says Kant handles this by describing experience as being through veils. Yeah. So the veils of like your consciousness or the veils of the concepts, like you only get so much information and you only put so much in. But again, what are you actually getting out of the world then? Are you just looking at the veil? How do you actually know that you have anything real at that point? So this is the question about like Kantian theory of mind. Lumpy says, are there still philosophers who believe that they can figure out the true nature of the universe by thinking correctly about it? Yeah, there's definitely rationalists out there, Lumpy. And that doesn't make them good philosophers. I'm going to have like a sort of a wide scope for people who call themselves philosophers. There's definitely a bunch of religious people who have like thoughts that they can just intuit the way the world is. And so maybe you don't want to call them philosophers. Maybe you want to call them religious folks or something. But yeah, my engineering point is quite apt. One of the things I think about is hilarious is that I don't know if it's by you, but Amazon has like these delivery vehicles all over the place around here, and it says choose two, cheap prices and delivered fast, and it blows my mind because the joke is that means you're getting the two things. That means the quality has to suck. Because like that's the joke is the three things of engineering, the triangle of engineering. It's you do it right, you do it faster, and you do it or you do it cheap. But if you get it, you done it right and done fast. It's got to be massively expensive, and whoever put that on the side of their vans didn't quite understand the joke or was making a joke at Amazon's expense, which I just find kind of funny. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so how do you actually get to the outside world if you are always just talking about your own concepts? Okay, as commentators like Willem de Vries have suggested, Sellars' notion of picturing is his provision for the necessary friction that ties our conceptual frameworks to the world. His external world realism and the theory of picturing are transcendentally motivated in serving as his explanation of the possibility of objectively contentful representations, ones accountable to something beyond our conceptual activity. If this realism, though, isn't novel, the ascription of transcendental phenomenalism to Sellars is. What exactly is this position? Well, I mean, this isn't a novel position. Like I said, goes back to the Tractatus of sorts and Kantianism before that. I mean, the Tractatus added the linguistic and logical to it. But like this, as Cinesemiotics reminds us, Kant describe this as looking through veils, like the way we see it. We're not quite getting the direct realism. It's like looking through something. Okay. Given how central this ascription to Siebert's Given how central this ascription is to Siebert's interpretation, this question is surprisingly tricky to answer. Indeed, the book initially sells itself short in this regard, framing transcendental phenomenalism as much more minimal than it really is. In the first few passages in which it's explained, Siebert characterizes it as a thesis about the objects of common sense in our present conceptual framework, namely Sellars' endorsement of Kant's phenomenalism with regard to the ontological status of the objects of the manifest image. Yeah, so basically what a lot of people handwave at is just like, well, the stuff that you have in your world or the stuff is just the stuff of everyday life. And they take that, and that's what you're getting. Like, that's it. And we interpret those objects, but the objects are still real. Okay. Thus interpreted, transcendental phenomenalism is merely the familiar Sellarsian contention that the world of the manifest image is a phenomenal world in the Kantian sense, existing only as the contents of actual and obtainable conceptual representings. It casts no doubt on our ability in principle, via the more adequate conceptual scheme of ideally mature science, Seller calls this CSP, to represent the world as it is in itself. We might have expected more from a transcendental phenomenalism, namely a view on which the gulf between appearances and things in themselves is itself a necessary condition of the possibility of human representation of the world, and so cannot even in principle be bridged. Yeah, so this is weird because if you're going to be transcendental, you want to say you want to transcend what we experience. But if we're just taking the manifest image, the things you're looking at as real, then you are not transcending anything. You are just getting the phenomenal reality, just the phenomena right then. And that's why this is a phenomenalism, because you're just getting it there and not a transcendental one. And the author here is saying, look, it's not transcendental there, it's just phenomenalism. Author says, I say this not to quibble with Siebert's label, but to help render more natural the thesis morphing into a more radical one later in the book. There, Siebert suggests that Sellars endorses a transcendental phenomenalism with regard to the objectual content of any conceptual structure, one that denies the conceptual instruments of science carve nature at the joints, and so applies the fundamental understanding of nature as well as our common sense concepts. This radical phenomenalist thesis clearly requires defense. It cannot be supported merely by appeal to the instability of the manifest image, as the initial familiar version could. So how does Siebert argue for it? Yeah, so if you're going to have some view where science is actually the underlying thing, that's what they're claiming right here, applies to the CSP. That's the underlying view, that science is more fundamental, as well as our common sense concepts. How do you get to that? And thank you for being here. I appreciate you. And have an excellent stream yourself. Bye. Yeah, and I do not begrudge any of you. If you want to go hang out with Ann, go hang out with Ann. That's cool. So, okay. But yeah, how do you actually argue for... How do you get from just like what you see is what is real to know what the concepts of science say are what's real? Okay. One argument he makes is an application of the myth of the given. Following ideal scientific process and conceptual change, our linguistic and mental items will picture the world entities better. But will we then take in these entities in perception just as they are? No, Siebert suggests. We must reject the dogma that with the aid of the sciences, we will come to experience things as they are in themselves, independently of a conceptual structure. So CSP, that's the fundamental way of looking at the fundamental scientific way of looking at the world, will enable us to picture better, predict more accurately, etc., but it won't enable the world to imprint itself on the mind like a seal on wax. Sellars' rejection of the given as mythical precludes his allowing that could ever be. Yeah, so this is interesting. So if we learn all the right things, will that somehow make it so when we see things like we're looking in the Matrix, basically, once we understand what's fundamental, then it'll be like the scene at the end of the Matrix, spoilers, where Neo sees all the green and all the code that he's looking at being in the Matrix. And they're saying, look, that's never going to happen. We're not actually going to, the way we look at the world, we're not going to see the atoms. We have to see the things of everyday life, but we're not going to, like, see the atoms. Like, that's crazy. Like, Neo could see the code when he was in the Matrix. So this, he says, no, you can't do that. I mean, that would be nuts, I think. And not only would that be nuts, just like in general from your experience, you can think, well, how would we be seeing the world better than like the ancient Greeks did? Like, we would in some sense be making progress in the last 2,000 years with our scientific knowledge, and we'd have to say, well, we see things more fundamentally than them, and clearly the things we deal with in our lives is not so different, because, you know, literature from like 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, like the ancient Chinese stuff, it all makes sense to us. We can look at paintings from them, and, you know, we can understand, like, you know, their paintings. Like, the culture isn't that different. Okay. Author says, what I don't see, however, is that this entails that even CSP must distort the characteristics of the worldly objects, which the characterization of its objectual content as phenomenal implies. Okay, so how does the scientific view even change the world then? At all. I mean, how do you actually understand the world better through scientific understanding? I think Seaworth neglects an alternative here, one akin to the neglected alternative, sometimes alleged to defeat Kant's argument for transcendental idealism in the transcendental aesthetic. What's a lot? Lumpy, I'm sorry, I've already moved on, and this is frying my brain. Why couldn't it be that CSB users must actively impose it in forming their objectively contentful experiences, and yet that the resulting objective contents describe worldly objects as they really are? If it could be, then this argument is insufficient to show that Sellars' transcendental phenomenalism must extend to the scientific worldview. Yeah, so this is asking why can't we impose this stuff on it? Okay, so Lumpy says, I enjoy understanding the physical reality of the world on a daily basis. Yeah. Yeah, but when you, okay. So the question is, in your daily experience, you can understand the world, but is that the content of your experience when you are looking at something? Do you actually see the when you look at the beaker, do you see the underlying chemical structure, or do you see the the liquid or whatever's in your beaker? You see the liquid. Now you know what's in there conceptually, the molecular structure, but you do not see the molecular structure, outside of your imagination. But do you actually see it? No, you see the beaker, you see the liquid, or maybe you see different colors, however you want to break that down. But you're not seeing the when you look at it, you don't see the chemical structure. You can imagine it, but you don't just see it. And so it's the idea that you could just sort of see it without imagining is that's the difficult thing. And so here's the question. So why, if you can't do if you're doing that, you can't just see the world the way it is, but the question is, why can't you get closer to that here? And so this is the question here. Why can't you actually get closer to doing that though? This is not debating being omniscient. No. If I made that sound like it is, I don't want to do that. But the idea is what is the experience of looking at the world? And could you actually, if you had it right, could you actually see the molecules? It's no, you can't see atoms. It's it's in the abstract. So you're not being omniscient. It's just you're seeing, more fundamental things, whatever they might be. So why can't you actually see more fundamental things? So if it could be, then this argument is insufficient to show that Sellars' transcendental phenomenalism must extend to this stuff. So it's you can't just argue that we don't do it. Maybe you can do it. Okay, perhaps Sellars' account of this song is too loud. Perhaps Sellars' account of perception poses a bigger problem for the idea that we could ever experience the world as it really is, however. After all, we've seen that Sellars claim that a key stage in the synthesis of experience, the step that bridges the gap between the brute, non-conceptual sense impressions and singular conceptual intuitions, is the formation of the image models. But these, essentially laden with perspectival character and that the real object lacks, are transcendentally ideal, so that the subject of common sense states of perceiving mistakes the features of his own sensory states to be features of external objects. All right, that was a terrible sentence. So it's again, what are we doing here? The perspectival character. So when you see anything, you're seeing it from an angle. You have your own perspective. So I'm over here, now I'm over here, and you're looking at stuff. So you're never actually seeing a face. You're seeing different angles on it. It's always there. But then, of course, the subject of common sense states perceiving mistakes the features of his own sensory states to be features of the external objects. So you're thinking of the face, but you're projecting that on the world. And because I'm always moving, it's never the exact right thing. You're sort of projecting the concept of face onto me when you see the video of me. Okay, so now surely even science concept users would perceptually encounter the worldly entities from particular points of view. But then it seems that they too would interpose image models between worldly entities and intuitions, that the latter's apparent reference to objects would be co-opted by the image models and their internal objects, and so that intuitions couldn't succeed in representing worldly entities as such, however adequately they might picture them in Sellars' technical sense. Lumpy says, no, indeed, they are smaller than the wavelength of visible light. Then this paper considers an impossible limit case. Well, that's exactly what it's talking about here. They're saying, what are they actually talking about here, and why is it transcendental? This is the question right here. Why is this account transcendental? Because they think you can talk about the real world in terms of like what's really behind our reality, like what are the small things, the concepts of science. So like we can't see them, but they think we can get at them, and that's why this is a transcendental theory. But like that's the question right there, Lumpy. You got it. So like this paper considers an impossible limit case. That's the transcendental reality. You're transcending. Johan, I'm sorry my alerts are down. I see you followed a few minutes ago. Thank you for the follow. Okay. As always, yeah, feel free to ask questions and whatnot if you're still here. If not, you can feel free to lurk. That's cool too. Okay. Authors' doubt about this argument concerns its premise that the reference of intuitions points only back to determinate sensory states, that is, to internal objects of image models, not to the objects that brought them about. Only this premise, I think, suggests that no perceptual representation can be adequate to its real object. Even if representations of objects' proper, sensible qualities or relations to the perceiver involve mistaking the features of one's own sensory states to be features of external objects. Yeah, so you're confusing your concept of the world for what's actually out there. There seems no reason to extend this to representations of objects' manifest intrinsic properties unless the representations simply fail to break through the veil of representations and refer to objects at all. All right, so all of a sudden we've got intrinsic properties here, which is interesting. So they're saying, the author is saying, well, you could actually break through. So there's no reason to extend this to failing to break through the veil of representations. All right, so this whole sentence here is kind of interesting. So yeah, it's a negative. No reason to extend this to failing to break through the veil of representation. So they think it might even be possible to get through the Kantian version of the world to the world in itself, to do the transcendent, to transcend. Okay, now, given Sellars' non-relational account of intentionality, this is in one sense the case. But I don't think this sense should be conflated with the one suggested by the premise at issue here. Indeed, I think Sellars rejects that premise. Quote, when Jones sees a chair, although his perceptual experience is founded on, guided, and controlled by his sensations, his perception is not about the sensations. It is about the chair. End quote. Sensory states or impressions are only causal, not intentional, intermediaries between conceptual representations and worldly items. They don't co-opt reference. True, reference isn't a genuine relation to worldly objects either, but must instead be explained in terms of interlinguistic function. But what is the relevant function of singular terms? The one that constitutes their senses. So yeah, what is it like if you say chair, what are you talking about? Like that's the singular term, the chair. Is it to be linguistic representatives of objects? To stand in naturalistically describable covariation relations to worldly entities as part of a broader linguistic picture? Accordingly, a term's reference, although a pseudo-relation, always presupposes real relations to its objects that render sentences in which it figures accountable to the objects for their correctness, without this accountability being screened off by the speaker's sensory states. And so it's not clear why intuitive representations in scientific concepts couldn't figure in claims that succeeding in describing worldly entities as they really are. So they're saying you can just get ideas and actually get this right. Like that's really what this says right here. Your concepts can actually be correct, and again, and that could just be how it is for scientific concepts. Like right there, saying, look, we can get things right. Like I see a chair, there is a chair, and I get that right. It is just correct. And why can't you do that for science too? Actually, though, I suspect Siebert is right that Sellars is ultimately committed to a transcendental phenomenalism that extends even to an ideally adequate conceptual scheme. I think the problem, though, lies primarily with our spontaneity rather than our receptivity, and in particular with the simultaneous indispensability and objective inapplicability of categories. Like what? Okay. So they're saying it's with our spontaneity. What is spontaneity? This is interesting. Like, why would you bring spontaneity in this right here? The problem lies in our spontaneity. What the fuck is spontaneity here? If you're granting that we can get things right just by looking at them, then what's the spontaneity of that have to do with it? Okay, let's approach it through an analogy to Kant. We've seen Siebert argue that for Kant, we reach the idea of the in itself via reflection on our receptivity. We analogically transpose the notion of cause from the phenomenal to the noumenal realm, positing things in themselves as the noumenal cause of our outer sense. So yeah, so the noumenal realm is the realm of things in themselves. Of course, the familiar problem with this maneuver is that causation is a Kantian category, and another key commitment of Kant's is that we can only cognize objects of possible experience via the categories, never things in themselves. Thus, he cannot consistently assert that noumenal affection obtains. Yeah, you just can't do it because you only have access to the phenomena that you see, not the things in themselves. My suggestion is that Sellars faces a structurally analogous problem. We've seen him grant that to think of an object at all is to think of it under the categories, in particular to think of it as standing in a nexus of causal relations and laws. Yet for him, as for Kant, or for that matter Hume, real connections between distinct matters of fact are, so to speak, entirely immanent to thought. So immanent to, I don't know if it is usually used in philosophy, meaning it's only within the realm of philosophy, within a certain realm. In this case, the immanence means they're entirely within the realm of thought on their own. So they're not something you're getting from the outside world. As De Vries remarks, Sellars thinks that causation is just another category, and that the real comprises a lawless world where things just happen. So that's a very Humean sense that there are no laws in the world. We impose them through our categories. Even the conceptual the scientific categories then cannot enable us to conceptually represent the world without severely distorting it, because it will necessarily project modal structure onto the world that the world lacks in itself. A full statement and defense of this critique must await another occasion, but should it succeed, Siebert's claim that Sellars is a radical transcendental phenomenalist would be proven correct. Okay, yeah, so this whole thing was like saying, look, it looks like Sellars was making this claim, but in the end, all of it breaks down. And so that actually makes the initial, what looked like a flat-footed claim to be correct. So that's kind of funny. So, yeah. All right. So, skepticism. And we're getting through this. Let's see. We're on page 10. We got to get through a few more pages of this. Yeah, 15, basically. 14 pages. So 4 more pages. 4 full pages, at least. But yeah, so this is like, got to talk about this sort of Kantian view of what it is in the world, like the Kantian view of mind is kind of here. And that's interesting. I hope you have any questions, let me know. I know it's really dense stuff to talk about this, and God forbid we should talk about what is not a Kantian view, because a lot of people hold this sort of view. And when you get into like the Fregean criticism of Kant, you've got senses and references, then it gets even more complex. Okay. Yeah. One of these days I'll try to do something. Like I said, I just got myself a paper rejected. I'm annoyed. I'm like, I wrote something that was interesting, but it's just not good enough to be published in a generalist journal, because it's just not going to, make the general population happy. Sociology of philosophy. What counts as a generally acceptable paper? Like, it's strange. Anywho. Skepticism. Let's turn to Siebert's treatment of Rorty's critique that Sellars' appeal to the picturing invites skepticism. what this person said about this person, and then invite skepticism. All right, so Rorty sees Sellars' non-relational accounts of meaning, reference, and truth as emblematic of a salutary shift from interpreting meaning in terms of representation to doing so in terms of social practice, sidestepping perennial problems about the mind's relation to the world in favor of pragmatic issues about what linguistic devices best enable convincing our fellows and controlling our environment. Yeah, so basically it was saying, look, we're not actually, when I'm saying like, oh, hey, there's a pencil, I'm not talking about the pencil. What I'm doing actually is convincing you of a certain thing, on Twitch. I'm making content. And so it really doesn't matter whether I'm referring to pencil when I talk about that actual object. What matters is I'm making content in stream content at this point. And so that's convincing our fellows and controlling our environment. That's, making content is what I'm doing. I'm not actually referring to anything in the world when I talk about that pencil right now. Okay. But so Rorty thinks that Sellars surrenders this gain by introducing picturing. So he's going to lose something here. Quote, as with all other accounts of meaning which insist on a tie with the world as a condition of meaningfulness, Sellars opens the gates to skepticism. We begin to wonder how we could ever know whether our increasing success at predicting and controlling our environment was an index of non-intentional matter-of-factual relation called matter-of-factual relation called adequate picturing. Perhaps the gods see things otherwise. Perhaps they are amused by seeing us predicting better and better while picturing worse and worse. So basically, that's saying like, hey, look, I might be making great stream content, but I am not talking about the actual world right here, like, because this isn't actually a pencil. I'm just making really great stream content. And so the more we, make good stream content, that has nothing to do with reality. So that's the skepticism. We might be talking to each other and thinking we're like hot shit, but like, are we actually talking about the way the world is? Who knows? Okay. For Seaworth, picturing is the linchpin of Sellars' theory of intentionality. Given Sellars' rejection of direct realism about perception and his non-relational accounts of meaning and reference, only picturing restores to cognition its grounding in and consequent accountability to the mind-independent world. Understandably, then, he's concerned to dispel this charge that Sellars should have eschewed picturing altogether. His initial response, though, strikes me as unhelpful. This is to remark that Sellars didn't regard picturing as serving an epistemic role in his philosophical system, that is, of providing an independently accessible mark of the correctness of our basic matter-of-factual assertions, but a transcendental role, that is, of enabling our language to be about the world, proving an objective definiens for the adequacy of a conceptual structure. That's true, but it's beside the point. Rorty actually recognizes that Sellars accords picturing a transcendental role. He remarks that Sellars introduces it as a necessary condition of meaningfulness. But picturing becomes epistemically relevant for the same reason that it can found the possibility of objective meaningfulness, because Sellars not only asserts that picturing relation obtains, but identifies as the criterion of the correctness of the performance of asserting a basic matter-of-factual proposition, the correctness of the proposition qua picture. Okay, so yeah, the picture actually has to do something, and so it actually has to represent the world, and so the fact is, if you're talking about this picturing, then it actually has to, be related to the world. That's why our linguistic items don't merely relate to the world, but further can be accountable to it as their objective contentfulness requires. But if correct picturing, you have to correctly do this. You can't just make up some account of the world. But if correct picturing constitutes Sellars' criterion for correct basic empirical assertion, for basic empirical truth, then his denial that correctness of picturing is epistemically transparent is the problem generating Rorty's objection, not the solution to it. Yeah, so how do you know that your picture of the world is the right picture of the world? Rorty's objection then can't be answered by correcting his Sellars' exegesis. We must do substantive epistemology. Happily, Sellars himself undertakes the task of explaining how we can be justified in making empirical assertions whose truth conditions aren't epistemically constrained, the question implicitly at the heart of Rorty's critique. And following his initial response to Rorty, Seaworth captures Sellars' primary response to this question well. It rests, in effect, on an appeal to semantic externalism. Okay, so we've got the answer is semantic externalism, whatever that might be for these people. We've already seen Sellars argue that the sense of a referring expression is its job, which is to covary with its object as part of a broader linguistic picture. This is the norm-governed functional role that constitutes the expression's meaning. Yeah, so when I say this is a U.S. quarter, like I'm referring to this thing being what is it? Well, I'm giving you an example of like showing what a functional role is. Like I'm giving you an example on stream, making content by referring to how I refer to U.S. quarters by showing you the U.S. quarter. Okay, but given what James O'Shea has called Sellars' norm nature meta principle, his claim that espousal of principles is reflected in uniformities of performance, and you can see this is a performance. Look what I'm doing. I'm making Twitch content. It's a performance, like anything else is too, but this specifically. So that the statement that a person or group of people think of something as something that ought to be done in a certain kind of circumstance entails that, ceteris paribus, they actually do the act in question whenever the circumstance occurs. Yeah, so if someone asks you what is a U.S. quarter, you could do this exact thing that I'm doing here and being like, this right here is a U.S. quarter. So you could do that act of like holding up a quarter. So whenever that circumstance occurs. All right. It follows that either a referring expression of ours generally succeeds in picturing its object, or else it lacks meaning altogether, since we don't actually espouse any norms of use that could constitute a meaning for it. More generally, the idea that our language is empirically meaningful entails for Sellars that we espouse norms governing language entry transitions, norms of specifying the environmental circumstances in which we appropriately non-inferentially assert particular claims, and so that we generally comply with those norms. All right, so you have to give a context, I guess, where the context of, telling people what a quarter is, like, that has to be appropriate. I don't like that. That's just hand-waving at, like, okay, hey, context, you need that. Like, to know when the appropriate time is to show people what a quarter is. Okay. Accordingly, to deny that we generally succeed in asserting observational judgments just when the environment is as they describe is simply to deny that our language is empirically meaningful in the first place. And so, as Siebert suggests, Sellars would reply to Rorty that the divergence between prediction and picturing can never become a reality because picturing always is a matter of the method of projection constituting our current conceptual structure. That is, while of course epistemically accessible signs of truth, like yielding correct predictions and correct picturing can swing free in particular cases, they cannot swing free writ large without our ceasing to employ a conceptual structure at all. Yeah, so they're saying, look, you're not going to get it right all the time. You've got like concepts that you apply to the world, but you can't always do it. And it's saying, well, you get it right sometimes. But that's like, all right, but when? And this is the question right here. And the author says, is this a sufficient answer to Rorty's critique? Personally, I don't think it gets us very far. To see why, notice that the Sellarsian response just sketched is a transcendental argument from the possibility of empirical meaning to our success in general at picturing the worldly entities. Now consider what's necessary for a transcendental argument to be dialectically useful. As Robert Stern notes, because the arguments are generally used to respond to skeptics who take our knowledge claims to be problematic, they typically begin from a premise stating some fact about us or our mental life which the skeptic can be expected to accept without question. The aim is to uncover weighty presuppositions of such unassuming premises. Now, the premise that our language is empirically meaningful initially seems like a perfect candidate for this role. Skeptics typically grant it and proceed to the question of whether our empirical assertions are warranted. Indeed, some skeptics might even suggest that it is indubitable that whether our empirical assertions are true or not, whether they're warranted or not, or at least we must know what they mean. Yeah, do you know what you mean when you are talking about stuff? Do you know what you mean yourself? The catch, though, is that skeptics of this sort are assuming an internalist account of meaning, one on which empirical meaningfulness doesn't depart on features of the thinker's external environment. Yeah, well, they're saying, look, you might know what you're thinking in your own head, but do you know anything about the world? If forced to stipulate with Sellars that the empirical meaningfulness of our terms presupposes uniformities of performance concerning their covariation with worldly objects, I don't expect such skeptics would continue to concede that our language is empirically meaningful, nor do I see that they would be rationally obligated to do so. Yeah, you can't just declare that our words always refer to stuff, and no skeptic's just going to buy that. Sellars remarked once that Kant is not attempting to prove that there is empirical knowledge, but merely to articulate its structure, to show it to be coherent and to uncover its weighty necessary conditions. The same could be said of Sellars himself with respect to empirical meaning. Unfortunately, though, that renders the premise that our thought and talk are empirically meaningful toothless in the skeptical context, given the contentious account of meaning on which his transcendental argument essentially relies. Yeah, so basically this is a dodge. He's saying, well, I'm just describing it. I'm not telling you how it is. I'm just saying all the necessary conditions. But that doesn't mean we actually have knowledge. You're saying all the conditions. That doesn't mean anything we're saying actually relates to the world. You're just giving necessary but not sufficient conditions to describe the natural world. And so that's a dodge, because what you want to do is you want to say you actually have knowledge of the world. And so it's not just you have the necessary conditions, but you have the sufficient ones, the ones that give you what you want, something about the world, sufficient to know something. Not just that you have like the background knowledge for it. It's understandable why Sellars, following Kant, does not endeavor to prove that empirical knowledge or even meaning are genuine. After all, he asks rhetorically, what premise could such an argument have? Gava guy, hey Ivania, how you doing? Hope you're well. We're getting through a somewhat complex theory, a Kantian version. Sellars. This is a paper on a book on Sellars' Kantian version of the world. So yeah, transcendental realism here. Yeah, so how could you actually, you're not proving that we have empirical knowledge or our language is even meaningful, but what premise could such an argument have? In one essay, though, after giving his transcendental response to skepticism, he goes on to give some independent reasons to accept that our basic faculties of empirical belief formation, namely introspection, perception, and memory, are reliable. These reasons are available, our inability to prove independently of the actuality of empirical knowledge notwithstanding, because they are practical reasons. Quote, since agency to be effective involves having reliable cognitive maps of ourselves and our environment, the concept of effective agency involves that of our IPM judgments, that's the introspection, perception, and memory judgments, being likely to be true, that is, to be correct mappings of ourselves and our circumstances. Note then that it is reasonable to accept that our judgments are likely to be true simply on the ground that unless they are likely to be true, the concept of effective agency has no application. End quote. Sellars' argument is this: we have the seemingly reasonable end of being effective agents. We can be effective agents only if our IPM judgments are likely to be true, so we're warranted in accepting that they are indeed likely to be true. The argument obviously requires a much more detailed reconstruction and defense, and even, in my view, some revisions before it will be entirely satisfactory. But that's a project for another day. At present, I can only say that I think of the gist of the argument is onto something so far as it goes. I think this argument is fucking terrible. This is one of those things where it's like, your brain is telling you that you're smart. That doesn't make you smart. That's like, and so they're saying, we're being effective, and so you think you're being, because you think you're being effective, and so therefore you are effective and your judgments are good. How the fuck do you know if you're, like saying you think you're smart because you think so, but idiots can think they're smart too, and they convince themselves of that, so they might as well just replace smart with being effective, and then you're in the exact same thing. This is terrible. Maybe this author can fix it, but I think this is a terrible argument. It's like, really? But you just read my paper on skepticism? Well, now you know why I'm so critical of other epistemologists. Because I have my own views on these things. But yeah, thank you for reading my paper. I appreciate that. I mean, if anything, it's short. So, it does have the virtue of not wasting a lot of time. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. All right. So how far is that? So, how far it goes? What is this argument for? So how far? What is that little circular argument? Because given what can you squeeze out of it? Well, one might say not very far. The argument seems pretty weak, since it doesn't show that our judgments really are true or likely to be so, or that we're epistemically warranted in accepting them. But at least it has this going for it. Since, plausibly, even the empirical skeptic will grant the reasonability of effective agency as an end, its fundamental premise seems significantly more secure than that of, and so it seems to have a better chance of establishing a warrant of some sort for us to hold our judgments than the transcendental argument. Oh, so one bad this is saying this bad argument is better than the other bad argument, and so therefore it is better. I mean, that does not, like, am I supposed to be impressed with like one bad argument being better than another bad argument? Okay. But like maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all that's needed here. Moreover, while many skeptics will refuse to rest content with the practical reasons for holding our foundational empirical beliefs, but will demand epistemic ones, that hardly seems like a response that would appeal to Rorty, who rejected any philosophical distinction that made no difference for how we ought to conduct our practice. Those of us sympathetic to that stance might judge then that Sellars' transcendental response to skepticism is not only not his sole response, but not even his most promising, and that his pragmatism, rather than being undermined by his appeal to picturing, actually does the work to fend off skepticism that preserves the viability of that appeal. Okay, yeah, so if you want to go make a whole nother pragmatic theory of knowledge, like, someone else might do, then that's better. Fine. But clearly not given here yet. But that's it for this paper. Thankfully, that was a lot of very big words coming at me very fast. I tried to do as best I could to break this down in a what I hope was comprehensible way while we were going through it. But like talking about Kant's transcendental realism, philosophy of mind, intentionality, things, very heady concepts. So I appreciate with you sticking with me for this one. But yeah. Okay, so what can we say about this? Well, this was for a book symposium about Siebert's defense of Sellars' account of intentionality. And so this was just like straight up metaphysics. We're doing intentionality right now. Intentionality is how we are thinking about the world. Like, what is it to be about the world? The aboutness. It's sometimes called aboutness. And so what are we getting in? And how do we know that we're like, what are we getting in is the phenomenalism. And then what do we actually know about it? These were the two horns in this paper. And the first one was like, okay, what was it? And then, like, do we actually know anything? And the author basically defended that it was a transcendental realism. I don't know if that's a good thing, but that's what they said. They said the description was actually kind of correct because you can't know anything about the world. It's transcendental, but like they were saying, you can sort of, what you can do is you can get like through the concept you have, you can sort of project a picturing onto the world. And if that picturing is accurate in some hand wavy way, then you actually do get at the thing in itself. In some way, you actually are then, your concepts are actually interacting with the way the world is through the conceptual structures, and the conceptual structures then somehow adapt through being effective in some way to how the actual world is underneath. Yeah, linking to reality. Thank you, Rob, yourself. So how that actually happens, they dodged out right here. They ducked out. They say it could be done because the Sellars had other things to say, but they didn't say it here. But like this whole thing right here was the last, like, oh no, there are other ways to go about this. And I mean, like Ivan said, I've worked on this myself or something similar to this. And so I have things to say about this, not in this, actually it's pretty close to this tradition, but I don't agree with what's going on here. I am explicitly anti-Kantian. So, but yeah, the pragmatism, like this is a good thing. Go pragmatic, maybe. And so maybe pragmatism can actually get your concepts in your head. How do they work with the things in the world? How do they link up to reality? Well, they have to rub up against them. There has to be some friction there. How does that happen? Not told. No one knows. Or maybe we know. But no one here knew. No one in this paper knew. Like this right here, they don't say how you actually get feedback from reality. How do you get feedback from reality here? Not told. And Ivan, if you read my paper, I start off my paper with talking about feedback from reality. That is exactly how I started off my paper, with feedback. So this is a problem for this sort of any Kantian style metaphysics where you're talking about like intentionality. How do you get something from the thing in the world in itself back into your head? We don't know. It just somehow has to happen, and that's why it's a phenomenal realism, transcendental realism. The somehow it is a real thing, and you transcend to it, but we don't. It's not given. It's just sort of magically happening, and that's why at the end we were saying, well, this is describing the necessary conditions, but it doesn't actually give you the sufficient link. It only tells you like the structure without actually telling you the mechanism by which the causal structure or the mechanism by which you actually link up with the world. So, cool. All right, I hit the 2-hour mark. I don't think I have it in me to do a third hour at the moment. So what's my alternative? Yeah, I mean, you can go call me some sort of weird pragmatist. Like, so you do have to have some sort of way of doing it. But I'm too logical at this point. I actually have some sort of, what am I doing? How to break this down? Well, how do you actually interact with the world? Is the question. Like, how do you actually do stuff? Yeah, I'm gonna. Oh, thanks, Semi-Ox, for being here. Thanks for the suggestions earlier. Thanks for the resub. Appreciate you. Thanks for 25 months was it? Yeah. So the question is, how do you actually interact with the world? Now, like, how do I actually? The answer at this point would be to describe intentionality. What is it to have conscious experience? I don't know if I have an account I can give you. I haven't even thought about answering that question in a long time. It's a good question. Should I have an answer to what it is to experience the reality and how we interact with it? In the paper, I just say, look, you have heartache. You have like these emotional responses that you have to like adapt or die for, and like that is the sort of thing like you can't keep going. In some sense, I'm not saying that we are effective. I'm saying that we're dead if we don't actually interact with the world. And so I start off with things like that. And so I don't actually describe intentionality. I would like to be able to do that. I'm actually thinking about something about that now, but it's just like the start of an idea, not anything worth telling anyone about yet. But like I don't have a worked out theory of intentionality. I can guarantee you it won't be Kantian. But other than that, I don't have anything to say. I can say in my epistemology, I start off with the actual cost that screwing up in the world has. So I start from the cost, and then I work back from there, which is very different from here, which starts from phenomena, and then somehow gets to the then has to hand wave at what the cost is, the actual friction in the world. So you can see the direction of argumentation's completely different. Physicalist? No, I'm not a physicalist. Like I'm kind of this I'm in this linguistic tradition too. So like language games and stuff. But again, that doesn't help you any, as this argument showed. Yeah. No, I'm a very strange person. Like I said, I've said this before. I'm basically argument theoretic. Like I just start with my arguments. That's all I do. So like I am not a physicalist. And I have no real problem with physicalism. I don't like very simplistic physicalism. I don't like naive physicalism. That drives me kind of crazy. But like a good physicalist is fine. But like just a really sort of like flat-footed one, just I find their arguments are terrible. And so that's what gets me. And so, yeah, but like I said, I'm argument theoretic. I'm thinking, what can I actually argue for? And what is it in an argument that, like, gets you going? So it's like, that's it. Yeah, I'm way more on the philosophy side of things than I am on the science side of things. I always felt more like a mad scientist than a scientist.